My name is Nina Kennedy, and since my husband's suicide almost 20 years ago, I have spent many years volunteering as an organizer of peer support groups for those who have lost a friend or family member to suicide. Joining me via Zoom today is Emily Griffiths. Emily is a registered nurse and is also a trustee of the charity Suicide Bereavement Support, based in Cumbria. At the time of making this recording here in the UK, we are almost 6 months into the COVID-19 pandemic, a challenging time to be joining the nursing profession. And although fighting COVID may be our main public health priority for now, the other illnesses and health problems have not gone away. This includes mental health problems and sadly also includes suicide and suicide bereavement, which is the subject of our podcast today. Emily?
So we'd like to start by reminding you of the importance of your own mental health. Working as a nurse, you need to bear in mind the need for self-care and self-compassion. It can be a stressful job. Your professional focus will be on the welfare of your patients, but as they say, you can't pour from an empty cup. You need to look after your own mental health in order to look after the health of others. Don't wait till you're struggling to reach out for support. Make self-care a part of your routine. As in every walk of life, being part of a supportive community of fellow students and colleagues and friends is important. And as a final thought on this topic, some of you will have experienced suicide loss in your own family or in your own circle of friends. So please be especially aware of your own needs when listening to this podcast, as it's very likely that it will lead you to remember and pull out emotions that you thought you'd buried.
Understood.
So because suicide bereavement is such a challenging and complex topic, we'd like to focus today on the one possible scenario a nurse might encounter, although of course there'll be many others. This scenario is where a patient or family member might mention that they've been bereaved by suicide in the course of other unrelated healthcare, or particularly in the course of bereavement care for that person or another family member. It's something a general nurse might come across in whatever area they're working.
So one of the major works about suicide bereavement to which we often refer is a book entitled A Special Scar, which was published originally in 1991 by Alison Wertheimer, who lost her own sister to suicide. She says of suicide bereavement, suicide leaves the survivor with a rag bag of painful and conflicting feelings. Guilt was probably top of my list, although I think this only surfaced gradually. I felt I should have been able to stop it happening. The fact that I hadn't even thought her suicide was a possibility didn't make me feel any less responsible. Survivor guilt can be pretty irrational. So in fact, all feelings can be pretty irrational, probably are irrational, but some of the feelings that come to the fore in suicide bereavement, well, they're similar to the feelings that we experience in all kinds of bereavements, but they can be particularly intense in suicide bereavement. There's a sort of twist in the tale of the suicide bereavement. Principal among these is the guilt, and I would also highlight the stigma, but perhaps we'll come to that a little bit later on. I think shock is a big part of suicide bereavement. Certainly in my own personal experience of losing my husband many years ago, and in the stories of the many people whose stories I have shared in suicide support meetings, guilt is the big one, and everyone struggles with the sense that they could have done more. Would that have been your experience, Emily?
one of the things I do find difficult is that people always say, well, you could never have known, you couldn't possibly have expected it. And in my case, it had been my partner's plan B for 10 years. So in that way, it wasn't the same kind of shock that it could be. And so again, I think it's about never assuming that you know something about a situation until the person tells you. You can't automatically assume that that nobody saw it coming. But definitely the guilt and the guilt at still being alive, and a complicated guilt, not necessarily of being that you should have been able to stop it, but still some feeling that there should have been, that you should have done something. A very, very complicated
Yeah. Yes.
feeling. That, yeah.
Yes. I mean, experiences, obviously each experience is unique, but some people have the experience of the suicide coming completely out of the blue, unexpected, and obviously in that scenario, how could they have done anything? But they still feel guilty. In other cases, the person may have been ill, they may have attempted suicide before, the bereaved person may have done all they could, but they were unable to prevent the suicide and they feel they should have. So whichever way it happens, there can be a burden of guilt, and it can ebb and flow. In time, these feelings do resolve, but they can flare up at certain times, and it's something to be aware of.
Just on the subject of preventability as well.
Oh yes.
We're recording this on the 18th of September, just after Suicide Awareness Day, Suicide Prevention Day.
Oh yes,
And
that's
it's
recent.
It's something to bear in mind that whilst people are talking about all suicides were preventable and if only all you need to do is talk to someone, the message for suicide prevention can be quite simplistic for a family that's
Yes.
been bereaved by suicide.
Yes.
The
Yes.
message that all suicide, as a simple kind of banner message, all suicides are preventable and you need to talk, is quite a simplistic message, which
Yeah. Yes. I
people
mean,
might who have been bereaved by suicide can actually find very painful.
yes, it can be maybe insensitive. I suppose that's the difference between a media campaign and actually boots on the ground support. That the reality is that the suicide that has happened can't be prevented. I mean, obviously, preventing future suicides has always to be a priority. And we like to think that some of the support that we give to those bereaved by suicide does help a little, because we do know that there can be a raised risk to people who have experienced suicide bereavement. So it's all part of the same circle. But on the other hand, another thing that very much troubles families who have been bereaved, and I think particularly a parent bereaved of a child, is the fear that there may be another suicide in the family, that the fear for their other children, fear for other members of the family. And again, although it's true that research does show that there is a slightly raised risk, it's not a huge risk, and it can be, you know, it can be magnified in the bereaved person's mind, and they can be extremely hyper vigilant. And I know that I was in the years after my own bereavement, I was constantly terrified that people were going to kill themselves, and you know, I was quite embarrassed sometimes by sort of try to rescue people that didn't need to be rescued, quite frankly. Um, so it's a balance. It's so complex. And in a sense, I suppose a suicide just disrupts the social fabric to such a degree that we can no longer trust our own feelings. Our feelings are so extreme in the aftermath of suicide. it's hard to get back on an even keel, and it takes time.
Yeah.
Um,
It's until you experience it, it's something that you would believe almost impossible because it's so going
yes,
against the very
nature.
nature of
Yes,
life that
yes,
you don't believe it's possible, and
no,
then suddenly
yes,
it clearly is possible and is something
yes,
that enters into your life, and
yes,
like you say, and that in itself is very scary, isn't it? It's a very scary realization
yes,
that
yes,
suicide.
it is.
I think um, you like to think that suicides happen in other people's families that are in some way fundamentally different to you, and
Yes,
then you
yes.
discover that actually it's something that can happen in anybody's
Y-
family, in
y-
anybody's life.
Yeah, I sort of like to illustrate that, and in a sense, this is the core of the stigma, I suppose. If you imagine a bereaved mother saying, "Oh, my son has been killed in a car accident," everybody would be very sympathetic to that mother, and they would also think that could happen in my family, that could happen to my son. But if a mother says, "My son has died by suicide," everyone would say, "Oh, very sympathetic towards the woman," but they would think it couldn't happen to my son. You know, it's it's not logical, but
Mhm.
we acknowledge that things like accidents and illness can happen to our family, but somehow suicide, that's for other people. So I think it's this reluctance and awkwardness around the whole topic of suicide that makes it difficult, and then that's what makes it so difficult for those left behind when it happens. And of course, it compounds the difficulties of people who are depressed and struggling with suicidal feelings and thoughts as well. So, in a sense, it's part of the problem. Historically, society in the Western world, in the Christian tradition, was very, very cruel to those affected by suicide, with people denied their normal funeral rites and the family being shunned and perhaps disinherited, and various other humiliations experienced by the suicidal and their families. And fortunately, that's in the past. Suicide was decriminalized many decades ago, but it still has a lingering stigma attached to it. And of course, in some more traditional societies, it can be even more stigmatized. So that, for instance, maybe people from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds may find that it's even more taboo in their societies, and that can be extremely difficult to deal with. And maybe we should mention that there has recently been a Punjabi women's group set up by survivors of bereavement by suicide, which I think is meeting online. And it's welcome to see a new service being provided for people that have specific issues in accessing support when they've been bereaved by suicide. So there are many other aspects of suicide bereavement that are more extreme, feelings of rejection by the person who's died, perhaps anger towards the person who has died. Maybe we recognize it's irrational that they were suffering, but our feelings are our feelings. We may look at people to blame, maybe the health team, maybe other members of the family circle that we feel weren't caring enough, that distanced themselves. Of course, the ultimate anger is the guilt we feel ourselves for what we did and didn't do.
I think for the individual and for people talking to the individual, one of the big things is understanding. You want to know the reason why, um,
Yes,
and
yes, of course. That's a huge
so
thing.
it can be very easy for someone to say, well, they committed suicide, they've just been, but their wife just left them, or they committed suicide but they had a difficult relationship with their parents or whatever. And um, trying to, it's a very human and immediate thing to try and understand why a suicide has occurred in terms of those kind of issues. But the reality is that the path, oftentimes at least the path that leads to someone taking their own life is multifactorial, and very so complex, and in a way by the person bereaved and the people around them wanting to find a reason, it's very near to finding someone to blame in a way. If someone's marriage failed, then what's the responsibility of their partner in that? And like I say, ultimately that isn't the reason why the death occurred. So if you're thinking about supporting people through the bereavement period, maybe just to a point of note, not to jump to a conclusion as to what the cause or what you perceive is the cause is. Be open-minded and listen.
Maybe I take a slightly different perspective on that, in that I acknowledge the constant need that some people have. Oh, I think we all have. Why? And I have had people say years after their bereavement, I still don't understand why. And I mean, often people will say they seem to have the perfect life. They were successful at school, they were successful at work, they had friends, they had everything. Why? You know, they had no reason. They had a fantastic life. So it is very, very complex. And certainly I would agree that so many of us, everyone has problems in life, relationship problems, work problems. Life is about negotiating all these hurdles. We have to strive, and we have various problems, all of us. And while it may be true that the problems contribute to the stress the person is under, it's far too simplistic to say because of this and because of that. And also, when you're talking about mental health, everything is interconnected. And yes, they may have had relationship problems, and yes, they may have had problems at work, but those problems could in themselves have been a result of their depression and mental health issues underlying. And everything can snowball out of control then once things start to go downhill. So trying to find out what was the cause, it's a sort of chicken and egg situation as well. Any life experience that any of us has is very complex. We have complex relationships. All of us have a lot going on. We're juggling a lot of things. And then the person who has extra problems, whether underlying within their own personality or whether in their circumstances or a combination, it's just impossible. And some people sort of explain it as the person, it's almost like an episode that takes over them, that in their right mind, so to speak, they wouldn't dream of doing such a thing. And that I suppose I feel that the real person who my husband was would not have done this. And I saw him struggle against his health problems, his mental health problems for many years, and take advice and follow his medication and do everything he could within his power to try and keep himself going. But unfortunately that day, things didn't go well for him. And I mean, it is a painful thought, but I do feel if he had got through that day, he might still be here, but he didn't. So it's a long process. It's complex. It's daunting to think about trying to support someone, but in a way, it's really just being with the person and letting them go through what they're going through, letting them know that you're there for them, giving them time and attention. And I think just not having any presuppositions, not feeling, oh, well, you should be over it by now. The fact is that someone years down the line may have a bad day when they are plunged back into their grief again. And it's just but just for now, in this moment, whatever has happened, they need that support. Obviously, if they're recently bereaved, they will need more intensive ongoing support. But I think we will understand that. I suppose there are so many there are so many stages and aspects to suicide bereavement, and I do see a sort of balance and something of a conflict between the recently bereaved and the sort of long-standing bereaved, because what helped me tremendously when I was recently bereaved was meeting people who were a couple of years down the road and had obviously got some of their strength back and their enjoyment of life. And that was an example for me. Yes, I can do this. This woman who was bereaved like I was, she's picked herself up and she's doing really well. But on the other hand, it's possible that someone who has been bereaved for a number of years may still be struggling or may be plunged back into grief. And it can be then very discouraging for the recently bereaved to see, it's been 5 years since she was bereaved and she's really upset still. Am I going to be still really upset in 5 years? But again, you've probably caught that person, that long-standing bereaved person, on a bad day. She'll be fine tomorrow. But it's try to meet the individual person at whatever stage of their grief they're at, whether it's early in the bereavement or whether it's some years down the line. And I suppose I could give just a quick mention to the scenario where someone was bereaved many years ago but have only just discovered, and again, this is an aspect of the stigma, they've only just discovered that the suicide happened. They were told it was a heart attack or an accident, but perhaps some information has come to light now and the truth has been revealed that their parent, that they perhaps only had vague memories from childhood of, that parent actually took their own life. And that person now has to cope with that grief all over again in a different guise, even though it happened so long ago. So there can be a complete denial of what happened in some families, and it can emerge. It's like a ticking time bomb then, and can emerge years later.
I certainly had a conversation with someone after my partner died, and it was known to my work colleagues that it was suicide. I
Okay.
certainly had a conversation with someone who's who had lost a parent 25 years before, and it
All
was
right.
actually the first time that they talked about it, because
Oh,
although it was known that it was suicide, the remaining parent did not talk about it, and that
yes.
was it.
Yeah.
And the the effect of coping with that, all through growing up and not being able to talk about it at all to your
Yes.
nearest and dearest is
Yes.
must be very traumatic, mustn't it?
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
and it's, again, that's, I can't imagine that there are other many other situations where that kind of blanket of silence
Yes.
could
Yeah.
be
Yeah.
imposed.
And I do think that that's where, well, the peer support group, which of course at the moment we can't meet face to face, but that is what I found so personally helpful and have seen others being helped. So many people would come to the group and say, well, I can't talk about this to my family. But perhaps in the group they'll meet, perhaps they can't talk to their own parents about having lost their sibling, but they'll meet bereaved parents in the group
Yeah,
and be able to share. And it's like the group becomes a surrogate family where
yeah,
you can share all your feelings that you perhaps, and maybe there isn't necessarily a blanket of silence, but each person grieves in their own way, and there may be a fear of hurting the other bereaved person in your family by talking about your own feelings. You might be worried about compounding the other person's grief, but you can speak more freely to a group of strangers who understand what you're going through. So I think it's always if people are looking for support, a support group is a good starting point. It's not for everyone, but where it helps, it seems to help a lot. It's I've seen a lot of people gain a lot from attending groups, and people coming back, month after month, and obviously getting a lot from talking to other people and hearing their stories.
And that feeling of wanting to protect the people that you love by not talking about bereavement, or that's common with other bereavements as well, isn't it? And that's why
yes,
talking to for if you've lost someone, and that's where all the other support groups for crews, for example, it's the same idea, isn't it? That you can talk
yes,
to someone that isn't involved and be more
yes,
open
yes,
than perhaps you can be with your own family. And it's not a reflection on the level of love and support in your family,
no,
just that it's
no,
easier to talk to somebody
mm,
who isn't directly involved, where you're not
yes,
watching what
yes,
you say in case you hurt them.
yeah, yeah, and often someone who's a step removed can have insights that you wouldn't think of yourself. So it is good to have a sounding board for your thoughts, and you know not to have to keep things to yourself.
Yeah.
Um, so how would we bring that back to the specific nursing role, Emily? Do you think? Um,
So if we go back to the end of that conversation about general bereavement,
mm,
um, so as Nina said during the introduction, I'm a registered general nurse, and I think when I look back now on how when I started my training as an 18-year-old, my understanding of bereavement, just generally, and the complexity of it, was so much different to what my understanding is now. And I do recall, and this may be something that no nurse is ever told now, and I do hope it is, but I do recall when I was doing my training, it being specifically said that a normal bereavement lasts 12 months, and after that you should be over it. And one of the things that I very much felt after my partner died, um, I was very, very much aware that that kind of straight line expectation around bereavement certainly didn't work in relation to someone taking their own life. But I must say, I actually suspect that it doesn't work in relation to any kind of bereavement. So
no, no, it doesn't.
the idea that you lose someone, and then in my case, I think I was off work for 5 weeks and then went back to work, and I was a senior nurse manager at the time, so you go back in straight into your job, and whilst you're there, you're expected to perform, and I can understand that as someone that manages other staff, but it's also um, very difficult, and the idea for me and for many of the people that are in the support group, um, there was that initial period of intense grief, but with any kind of bereavement, things can occur later that bring it back,
Yes,
and because where someone's taking their own life, the bereavement is likely to be that much more complex, isn't it? And those um, it, it is described as a complex grief because of all the things that
yes,
we've talked about.
mm,
So um, the the model that I learned as a student nurse, where you kind of had 12 months and you work through your Kubler-Ross stages
yeah,
of bereavement, and then you come out the other end as sorted, is
yeah,
much not the case. Um, sorry.
yeah. I mean, in my personal um, obviously I'm just one person, I would have felt, looking back, that say when I lost my mother, I would say it took me 2 years to kind of get back on track. And with my suicide bereavement, I would make that 4 or 5 years. But I don't want to say that I was like absolutely in the depths of despair for 5 years. No. Um, I, I mean, there was an intense period of months, I suppose, and then there were ups and downs. But it certainly took me 5 years to feel that I was back on track and back to being myself and strong and able to plan a life for myself. So it does derail your life for quite some time. It becomes the main thing in your life for several years, I think. At least that was my experience. I worked, I did stuff, I met my friends, I did all those things, but it was against the backdrop of a constant, well, battle to keep things together. But there are people fighting this battle all the time, all around us, and we won't necessarily know the battle they're going through. I mean, it's a cliche, really. Nobody knows what battle someone else is having to fight. So I guess just to be aware and perhaps not to impose your own views. And I mean, that's just to be supportive to people in any kind of situation. I think those are the key things. To be able to listen, to be open, to be supportive, to be positive. I think you put together some thoughts about sort of tips for nurses that we might end up
Yeah,
our
I was
podcast with,
actually going to.
Emily.
Yeah, I was going to
Yeah.
say. So, to summarise some of our thoughts on this difficult topic, firstly, never underestimate the value of listening in a non-judgmental way, and saying something, even if you say, I don't know what to say, that's so much more than avoiding or walking away from the
Mm.
situation. I don't know what to say. I can see that you're in so much pain. I am. Would you like a cup of tea? Is so much more than avoiding the situation. Secondly, it's important that you think through your own experience of loss, especially if you've had a traumatic loss, or possibly you've lost someone yourself through their taking their own life, or if you've experienced depression yourself and have had suicidal thoughts. It's hard to do, but you need a certain level of self-awareness, because if you feel that you considered taking your own life and chose not to because you're a strong person, and then you're talking about someone that's taking their own life, and I've had it said to me, someone that commits suicide, it's because they're weak, isn't it? It's just because they're weak and selfish. I found that so upsetting, and it was a reflection on that person's view of themselves, not on my situation. So that level of self-awareness is important. Just to reiterate, if the person is angry at the healthcare system, then yes, the healthcare probably wasn't perfect, because it never is. All healthcare staff are just humans, and we've all made mistakes. We've all forgotten to go back to someone, forgotten to return a phone call, spoken more sharply than we should. I've been a nurse my entire life, and I absolutely know that I'm guilty of all of those things. Um, it doesn't mean that ultimately that the healthcare system was to blame, or it doesn't mean that ultimately that person thinks that the healthcare system is to blame. It's just at that moment that's what's on their mind and they want to share. And if you can listen to that in a non-judgmental way, and then and without hurting yourself, so without going away and feeling blame, or if you do, being self-aware enough to go and talk that through with someone, then you're doing a good job. It's not your job you're not going to fix someone that's bereaved. You're not going to make them feel okay. Part of bereavement is feeling sad. It's a process that person has to go through, and you might not feel that you've helped them by sitting and listening, but it's very likely that you have, and at some point they may or may not acknowledge that, but it doesn't. You're not going to solve the problem. You're not going to make them feel better instantly, but that doesn't mean that you don't listen. Be aware of the trust bereavement facilities. If there's a bereavement office that has access to counselling, bereavement counselling services, that's aware of the local support groups, that's something that you can offer. Again, they might not want it now, but if you can give someone a leaflet for a local support group, that they might put it on the table and forget about it for 6 months and come back to it. But it's a useful option to have available. And be aware of what language you're using. Don't make assumptions. So comments like, you could never know this was going to happen, or you must feel really guilty. You're trying to be non-judgmental, but there's still a judgment in it, if that makes sense. So try and keep your language neutral or positive to the extent that you can. And finally, be aware that suicide will cast a very long shadow, as oftentimes any death can. You can, if you can have lost a parent and still feel it in 20 years' time, and with any kind of complex bereavement, the feeling of loss can go on for a long time, and suicide is one of those complex bereavements. So someone may want to talk to you about it 20 years after the event, 30 years after the event, and that's okay. And if you're the person that they've chosen to talk to about it, whether it's the hour after, the day after, or 20 years after, then hopefully you can listen in a non-judgmental way and be aware of how privileged you are to have that opportunity. Thank you.
Thanks, Emily, for that summing up. And thank you all for listening to our podcast. We hope it's helped you gain some understanding or improve your understanding of suicide bereavement.